Good afternoon. My name is Sue Brookhart. I'm an independent consultant and author, and McGraw-Hill Education has asked me to talk with you this afternoon about performance assessment. We'll talk about what it is, and we'll see some examples. I hope lots of different examples that give you a sense of what performance assessment can do that perhaps just a regular test cannot. Oops, I went past. Let's start by looking at one. This is a third grade performance assessment, a very simple one, and the students were studying polygons. The teacher wanted to know if the students could recognize polygon shapes in their everyday life. And so her assignment was to draw a picture that had at least 4 different polygons in it and to label the polygons. And here is an example of one. Pretty typical student picture, right? A house with a path leading up to it and a tree. But if you look closely, you'll see that there are several polygons. They're labeled quadrilateral, triangle, octagon, pentagon. I think there are a couple more in there, maybe too tiny for me to see. And this assignment allowed the teacher to see how the student was thinking about polygons in everyday life. If that's what the teacher wanted to know, this was a wonderful assignment. If the teacher simply wanted to know if the student knew what a triangle or a quadrilateral was, it would have been easier and more efficient to give a test, or maybe even in this case a little quiz. So that's a big first point about performance assessments, and that is that you want to make sure that what you want to assess excuse me, is something that's worth the time and energy for a performance assessment. Performance assessment can be defined excuse me, in 2 parts. A performance assessment requires students to create a product, which is what we just saw. The students had to create that little product, that drawing, or demonstrate a process, or both. And the scoring or evaluation of that work is done with observation and judgment. Now, sometimes this bothers people. They see the word judgment and they get all upset. Wouldn't it be much more objective to give a test? Well, no, not really. When we talk about subjective and objective in scoring, what we really mean is how closely 2 scorers would agree. If you have an objective test, say a multiple choice test, and I give you the scoring key, you would get the exact same scores for the tests you scored as anybody else would. That's what's objective. The test itself was written by a teacher or by someone like a teacher at a publishing company. The test itself is only as valid and as useful as the questions that are on it. And that is certainly based on someone's judgment or maybe several someone's judgment. So don't get all upset about the fact that performance assessment uses judgment for scoring. It's professional judgment, and as we'll find out later on in this hour, it's based on clear criteria systematically applied, and that's key as well. So if a performance assessment has 2 parts, both you need a task, but you also need some sort of scoring criteria, then today we'll talk about each of those parts in turn. Why would you want to use performance assessment? One of the things that performance assessment is good at is it shows students what they actually can do with their knowledge and skills. If a student is learning to write, The most obvious assessment would be to get them to write something in the genre that they're studying, a short story, a letter, whatever it is. Asking them test questions about writing is obviously one step removed. If students are learning to use a microscope in a science lab, then the most direct assessment of what they're learning to do is to watch them using a microscope in a science lab, or give them a task that in order to do it correctly, they have to use a microscope in a science lab. Perhaps draw a cell that's on a slide. So it shows the student what real work looks like in whatever area they're studying. Performance assessment is active. Students have to do, make, say, or write something. They are often more invested in performance assessment than they are in just answering a set of test questions. Performance assessment can assess complex standards. The one we started with, the polygon one, didn't. But if you can imagine standards that require students to understand things and then apply them to design or create something, that mix of knowledge and skills needs to be tested with something more complex than a test question. And rubrics for evaluating performance on a task are also good teaching tools because they summarize what good work looks like for students. And students can use those formatively as they are learning. And then at the end, when they are evaluated for a final grade, you can use them summatively as well. So performance assessment is real useful for some of those things that simple test questions just don't really get at very well. Now, having said this, I don't want to imply that there's an actual line between performance assessments and tests. It's really more of a continuum. How big a writing task does an essay test question have to be before it ceases being an essay test question and starts being a performance assessment? And there are measurement theorists of all kinds who have written much on the continuum between selected response and constructed response assessment methods. Pretty much all of them agree that it's, even if they have different categories along the way, they pretty much all agree that it is a continuum. But for today's purposes, I'll often talk about performance assessments as opposed to tests, because those are the sort of two categories that are, in practical terms, often what classroom teachers have to think about. Here we go. When you plan a unit, you start with a set of unit goals, which are based on standards, and you need to look at your unit goals right at the beginning, before you plan your unit, and see what kind of outcomes you're actually asking. What kind of learning are you actually aiming to have students accomplish? And decide which of them would be best assessed with a test and which of them would best be assessed with performance assessment. If you have students who need to recall facts or understand concepts, the most efficient and effective way to assess those things is with test questions, whether they're selected response or constructed response. The reason for that is that you can ask a lot of questions on a test. On a performance assessment, you typically only have one task, or maybe a small handful of tasks. But you can't ask very many things because students have to do something for each task. So you actually can get a better sample of what students know on a test if it's a bunch of facts or a set of concepts that you want to hear them explain or apply to solve a paper and pencil kind of problem. If Students need to actually design something. If, for instance, you are trying to teach students how to create a certain kind of writing, or how to design, in a science class, how to design a certain kind of machine that actually works and does something, or if you want to teach students to perform a process like using a computer program or keyboarding or using a library electronic card catalog, then you pretty much are stuck with performance assessment. Any test you give for those skills might be about the terms involved, or they could explain what they might do. But if you want to see if they actually can do it, you need a performance assessment. And then there are a couple of kinds of outcomes that you could assess with either a test or a performance assessment. If you want students to apply knowledge to solve problems, you can do that on a test, but on a performance assessment, you can ask students to do more extended problems and to explain their reasoning, which is often a very good example, a very good reason to give a performance assessment. If you want to ask students to analyze information or obtain and analyze information, they can do some of that with test questions, especially constructed response test questions. But if you make the tasks a little more meaty and require explanations, then you sort of move into performance assessment. So the first thing you do is look at your unit goals and say, which kinds of assessments am I going to use? The reason that's important is because those you should start planning right at the outset, right at the time when you plan your instructional activities. You also should plan your assessments. So we'll do a couple examples here. Here's a very simple one, a fourth grade unit on rounding. So students need to learn to round whole numbers to the nearest 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000. They need to round amounts of money to the nearest dollar amount. They need to estimate the answer to addition and subtraction problems using whole numbers through 6 digits. And they need to solve problems requiring estimation and rounding. All 4 of those goals could be assessed with a test. But I'm going to give you a second to think here. Do you see one of them that might actually also be able to be assessed with a performance assessment? If you thought it was the last one, you were right. Solving problems requiring estimation and rounding could be short test-sized problems, but they also could be project-style problems where students needed to build something or make something or put a carpet on something or paint the walls of something, and they needed to do estimation and rounding and, importantly, explain what they were estimating, how they were using rounding, and write that out or speak it in some way so that the performance task was more involved than the test question. The advantage there is that you can use students' new rounding skills in more realistic tasks, in more realistic settings, the kind of things that as they live on in life, they will actually have to use their estimation skills for. The downside of that is those kind of problems take longer, so you can't do as many of them as you could give test questions. So let's try another one in a different subject. Here's a English Language Arts, a 6th grade unit. The students had to define some literary terms. They had to summarize sections of the book. Actually, that's what the teacher told me. The actual goal would be something like learn how to write summaries. Explain the author's purpose in various sections of the book using appropriate literary terms, and make inferences about the main characters based on what they say or do. Well, for sure, the first one could easily be assessed with a test. Summaries, depending on How extended they were could either be short essay questions on a test or performance assessment. But explaining author's purpose in various sections of the book, actually analyzing the book and writing something long enough and involved enough to make claims about what the author was trying to do with various scenes in the plot and with various characters' actions, and using appropriate literary terms for that in an essay-length piece would be considered a performance assessment. Same thing with making inferences about the main characters based on what they say or do. Typically, that would be longer, more theme-sized or essay-sized things. So now we could go on, but we're going to stop with a one math and one language arts example. The point is that no matter what your subject, you look over your unit goals and you decide, how am I going to assess them? Test, performance assessment, both, and then you plan your assessments in your unit accordingly. Another thing you have to remember to do is match the rubrics to the learning goals as well as the performance tasks. You can kind of think of it as a little triangle. On one corner, you've got the learning goals you're trying to assess. On one corner, you've got the task, which has to be a direct match. If you ask me to do something, it has to be something that will give you evidence that I have, in fact, achieved the standard you're trying to figure out if I've achieved. But the rubrics also have to match as well. If you have a lovely theme, for instance, that describes why the author would have chosen to have a plot resolve in a certain way, and what he might have or she might have been trying to do in the novel by doing that. But if your rubrics don't have a category, don't have a criterion that looks at the quality of students' thinking, the way the claim is stated, is it clear, and is it supported with details from the text, is the reasoning explained? If you don't have rubrics with criteria like that, but rather you have rubrics that say, did they get the facts about the book right? Then when that essay leaves school, when it leaves the building and goes home with the student, all your evidence of student thinking goes home as well. It's only if you actually have criteria in the rubrics that match the learning goals, including the thinking that's supposed to have been learned, that you actually have a consistent, coherent performance assessment that really does tap the learning. For instance, if I am supposed to be learning to understand author's purpose and learning that authors have intentions when they make events happen the way they do or when they put characters in scenes the way they do, then there needs to be a criterion in the rubric that looks for the quality of my thinking in that regard in my work. So the performance assessment design process goes like this. First, you identify those learning goals. We've talked about that. Then you draft a task. You check, does that task match exactly what it is that the students are supposed to be learning? If the students did what I asked, would I get evidence of how well they have achieved the learning goal I'm trying to assess? Then you draft criteria. What am I going to be looking for in that evidence? Then you audit the task and check that it asks not only for what you're trying to assess, but doesn't require irrelevant skills. Of course, the famous one in that regard is math problems that require too much reading. But there are also in performance assessment some sneaky little irrelevant skills that get in there. Like, for instance, if you decide you're going to have students do an oral presentation, then what about the student who just is petrified of standing in front of 30 of her closest friend classmates? You need to make sure that you're not judging comfort, smiling, all of those things. What about a performance assessment where the students have to write a skit and perform it, dramatizing some historical event? Be sure to bracket out the students that have that little extra ham that make them much more fun to watch. If you're not assessing acting skills, make sure that doesn't creep in and color your observation and judgment of what you are supposed to be observing, which in this case would be understanding of a history event. Then when you're pretty sure that you've got a task and criteria, fill the task out. Tasks will need directions. They sometimes need materials. Sometimes there are partial scaffolding kinds of things like guides for research or guiding questions, or charts for students to fill in, graphic organizers to help their thinking along the way. Not the final product, but things along the way that you can assess formatively and that also will help students to do what they're supposed to do. All of that needs to be developed to go around your task. And then you need to make rubrics from the criteria. And we'll talk about rubrics in a little bit, but for now it's enough to know that the criteria are only one part of the rubric. You also need performance level descriptions. Once you have all of that developed, it really works best if you try out the task with a few students, because you're never sure that students are going to respond to what you designed exactly as you intended. If that's not possible, at the very least, ask a couple of students to read it and tell you what they think they would be supposed to be doing if you gave them that task. Performance assessment's biggest trap are retelling tasks. These are things to avoid when you design a task. And I've got this lovely example that I pulled off of Pinterest, which is a wonderful source of bad examples in education. This is a planet poster. This one is about Pluto. You can't probably see them because of the glare, but the student copied a number of facts about Pluto on the little white panel in the middle, made lovely colored letters that said Pluto, and then found a bunch of pictures, probably mostly on the internet, put it all together, and there it is, a Pluto poster. The problem with this is that it doesn't actually match any kind of serious science, or in this case science, learning goal. You have evidence that the student can locate and copy information about a planet. You really don't have any evidence if they even memorize the information, if that was your goal. You have evidence that they could find it. You have some evidence about artistic ability, but unless this is a multidisciplinary performance assessment, there is no science standard that says the student will make a pretty poster. So, and retelling tests like this abound in performance assessment in both elementary and high school. I have examples actually at all grade levels. It's amazing. It's not just little kids that get asked to make pretty things and think they've demonstrated learning. So when you design your task, make sure that you check that students have to do some thinking and not just collecting of facts in order to do your performance assessment task. Avoid retelling tasks at all costs. Performance assessment really covers a very wide variety of kinds of things. There are simple processes that you can observe, like when an elementary school student learns to make a capital A, and the criterion is literally a model that's on the wall in front of them. You're a successful A maker if your A looks like this one, and there it is on top of the board, just like it has been for 100 years. Simple products can be assessed. We started out with an example that was a simple product. However, although it was simple, that product required a little bit of higher order thinking. It required the student to connect what she knew about polygons with what she knew about her everyday life, and to merge the two, which is not hugely creative, but somewhat creative, in a way that would give evidence that she could identify polygons in everyday life. You can also assess complex processes, like using a variety of basketball skills to play a game of basketball, like participating in author's chair, if you're familiar with that. It's usually an elementary school writing thing where the author gets to read, and his peers give him feedback. That's a process the teacher observes. Or making complex products. Excuse me. Complex products like drawing conclusions about a historical event, designing a mathematical model. You're familiar with big complex performance assessments like the science fairs that we've come to know and love. Some of these products literally take a whole report period to produce and assess all kinds of things. In this exercise, we're going to look at two performance tasks, one very simple and one very complex, and try and figure out what exactly is being assessed. In the process, I'm also going to, I hope, give you a little object lesson in the fact that little kids and students who are not particularly high achievers, and also big kids and students who have advanced achievement levels, all benefit from performance assessment. So here is an example from a grade 3 Title I reading class. Title I, as you know, is that means this student would have been identified as at risk in reading. And they made they did an analysis here on a picture. They read a story. They read it together, called Snowzilla, and the question that the teacher posed is, how is Snowzilla like a regular snowman, and how is Snowzilla different from a regular snowman? Analysis level thinking, right? And they had this is a teacher-made graphic organizer. It's not really a Venn diagram. It's just two circles. But if you look carefully, you can see that despite the numbers, don't pay attention to the numbers, she didn't count them right, she has actually identified 3 different ways that a snowman and Snowzilla are different: in size, in what their eyes are made out of, and in whether or not they're wearing a hat. So this little girl may be at risk for reading, but she can think, right? We have evidence of it here. And then, again, don't pay attention to the numbers because she didn't count right. But she does have one similarity. A snowman and Snowzilla are both made of snow, like other snowmen. So I would suggest that while the reading and writing may leave something to be desired from at the level of grade 3, that this performance assessment actually shows that this student knows how to think and knows how to take what she read, namely in this case something about Snowzilla, and apply it to something else that she knows, which is an excellent reason to do a performance assessment. That bringing together of two things. Here's another one at a very different level that brings together two things. In this case, the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, which was read in a grade 12 English class, and a regular U.S. newspaper. So the students read Julius Caesar and had studied all sorts of things about it, and as their culminating activity, They were supposed to show deep understanding of the play, and by connecting it to a newspaper. And the newspaper was supposed to come out either the day of the assassination of Caesar, the day before, or the day after. And as you can see, this one is Caesar's already dead. This comes out the day after. If you read, and of course you can't, it's too tiny, but if you were to read the lead story there, you would see a wonderful summary of the play, Julius Caesar. If you were to read the eyewitnesses' story below, you would see a wonderful summary of a little side bit of the plot of Julius Caesar. If you take a look at the title of the paper, and if you remember your Shakespeare, ambition is certainly one of the themes in Julius Caesar. And then down the side are just some wonderful little connections that demonstrate that the student can use what's in Julius Caesar to make connections all over the place, including some that are quite humorous. Caesar's sandals sold on eBay is only funny if you realize that there was no eBay in 44 BC. Toga rentals is only funny if you know what a toga is. Seniors want to do things like rent tuxedos for prom, and togas are very fancy Roman garments, so that's a connection that makes sense and is funny. And there are a lot of them down the side like that. So this is a marvelous performance assessment to do some of that making connections thing with literature. Notice that a very able 12th grader and a not-so-able 3rd grader have both just shown you that they can use performance assessment tasks to give you evidence of what they know. In a way, I hope I selected the examples well enough, in a way that you would not get if you just asked them questions on a test about Snowzilla or about Julius Caesar. Okay, well, at this point we could talk about more tasks, but we have one half of the performance assessment left to talk about, and that is how are you going to use your observation and judgment to score them, or if you use rubrics, I really recommend that you give the students the rubrics at the time you make the assignment for the assessment so they can use them to help them guide their own and regulate their own work as you go along. Give them feedback based on those criteria. And then at the end, of course, you have to, when it's time to take a grade, you use the same criteria you've been using all along. True rubrics have two elements, though, criteria and performance level descriptions at all levels of performance on each of the criteria. True rubrics do not necessarily have to be set up in a chart that looks exactly like the one you're looking at in front of you. The criteria can be across the top and the levels down the side, or they can be just typed in no chart at all, but just criterion by criterion with the levels under it. There's no magic format. But what does have to happen is you do have to have those levels of performance quality described. And the reason for that is that the students need to see what it is they're aiming for. They need to see each of those criteria as a continuum of quality, and that they're trying to give you the best quality work that they can give you. So here's an example of one of the best rubrics that I know. This is a math problem-solving rubric. It was published in a math teacher's magazine called Teaching Children Mathematics. And it comes from the 5th grade class, of Breyfogle, the second author there, who had learned that her students were very good at getting the right answers on the state test, but not so good on that explain your reasoning part. They had been taught math without much performance assessment. And so she took the three criteria you see across the top, the math knowledge, problem-solving strategies, and the math communication, those come from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics criteria, and she just took the NCTM materials and made them specific to her students, and especially she made them student-friendly, so that, for instance, if students want to know what does it look like what does a good explanation look like, well, I write what I did and why I did it. I explain each step of my work. I use math words and strategy names. I write the answer in a complete sentence. And that's what they were aiming for. She had them do a performance assessment each week for 5 weeks. She gave them a little problem set. They had to self-assess using these criteria. And then on Friday, she had a brief conference with each of the students in her class who explained why they were assessing themselves the way they did. This was all formative, so there was no threat of, I have to claim to be better than I am because I want a good grade. And by the end of 5 weeks, all of the students in her class, even her identified learning students with identified learning disabilities, had improved in their mathematical communication. Why? Because they got to practice with a clear statement of what good work looks like. They got practice at monitoring their work. They got practice at applying these criteria to their work. And those criteria are pretty straightforward and understandable. And fifth graders could do that. So the power of performance assessment is only partly in those tasks. It's also partly in the rubrics. Criteria should be about the learning, not about the requirements for the assignment. No directions. I see so many awful rubrics that are basically directions in a box, and they mismeasure students. I won't have time in this presentation to give you an example of what happens when you use bad rubrics on student work. But if you are coming to the live presentation that I'm going to do in a couple of weeks for McGraw-Hill, I have an example. It's horrible. If you use rubrics to just encode the directions, you're doing a disservice to everybody, not the least of which disservice to the whole notion of what performance assessment is for. Come on. Next slide. There you go. Effective criteria have to be appropriate to the standard that you're measuring or the unit goal, definable, observable, distinct from one another, and complete in the sense that if you looked at all of these things in the evidence of student work, you would have a complete description for the purpose that you are using the performance assessment for, which, namely to assess student achievement of one or more learning goals. And then they also need to be able to be described along a continuum of quality. If it's just something that's present or absent, then you don't really need rubrics, and you probably don't need a performance assessment. For the sake of time, rather than giving you more didactic stuff about this, I'm just going to give you an example. Come on. There we go. Effective performance descriptions are actually descriptive as opposed to evaluative. So you don't say you have a good topic sentence. You say you have a topic sentence that clearly lays out what the paragraph is about, or something like that. They're clear to the student. They cover the whole range of performance. They distinguish among levels, like the math one you just saw. What makes the 2 better than the 1? What makes the 3 better than the 2? If there's a level called proficient or mastery or something, make sure that what's under that level actually does describe mastery or passing or proficient work. And the descriptions from level to level need to be parallel. So whatever you talk about in one level of the criterion, you have to talk about in all of them. And as I was saying we're just going to do one quick example because my time is coming to an end. This is the only example I have where a teacher is let me use her bad example and her good example, her before and after. That is really rare. So we're going to use it even though, as you can see, this was a retelling task. Students, the science standard that they were trying to assess is students will understand that living things have life cycles. And the students had to each pick a critter, an animal, and make a poster with their life cycle on it. Didn't have to be a butterfly. Could be anything. Well, as you, I hope, realize, that is a retelling task. But take a look at the rubrics, putting up with that. If you look down the side at the criteria, 2 of them ought to jump out at you as probably not related to getting evidence that students understand that living things have life cycles. Take a look at that left-hand column where the criteria are. Are 2 of them jumping out at you? I hope so. There is no Pennsylvania science standard, this is from Pennsylvania, for putting good titles on posters. And there is no science standard for the overall appearance of a poster. So in that large collection of points there, you actually have a lot of noise and not much signal. And then look in the illustrations of the life cycle stages. They're just counting them. 2 illustrations, 3 illustrations. Well, what if you have an illustration but it's not helpful? Like maybe it doesn't actually illustrate what the animal was doing at that stage of the life cycle. The point isn't just having of the illustrations. The point is that they help you communicate what's going on with the animal at that stage. So we revised these. We changed the scale for reasons that aren't particularly relevant here. We kept the 3 criteria that actually had to do with understanding the life cycle of an animal. And we changed the performance descriptions so that, for instance, now the illustrations show what happens to the animal. And you still only have a retelling task, but at least you have one that is assessed with a description of evidence of the learning goal that they were going for. Students could use these during the preparation of their poster, and that would help. What would really help is if the teacher had given a slightly different assignment where they had to find an animal, figure out what its life cycle was, and then do something with that information. Plan a zoo enclosure or something for that animal that would have them using the information that they were learning. And then if they did that, then one of these criteria or more ought to be about the appropriateness of what they designed, their explanation of their thinking about their design, and those sorts of things. So now what about that poster title, and what about that looking pretty? Because we don't want yucky posters on the wall of the classroom. You can put those, you can put those on a checklist that students can use as part of the directions for the assignment, or they can check each other's, or you can check them in. That when they're turning them in, they can check these off before they hand them to you. There are lots of ways you could use this. So this is assessed, but not in the assessment of academic learning that you're examining the performance assessment for. So that is about all we have time for. To summarize, I want to remind you that performance assessments, and I'm going to take questions. I do have a question slide here. To summarize, I want to remind you that performance assessments are assessments where there's a task, a process or a product that you observe, and that are scored with observation and judgment that describe the performance as evidence of the the learning goal. And the sum of those two parts is a performance assessment. Okay. We have left about 15 minutes or so for questions if you have any. I am not seeing questions written into my Q&A box, so I'm going to give just another minute to see if there are any questions. Will this webinar be made available to us after today? I think so, but tech support will tell you for sure. Okay, I do have some questions here. Is it okay if there aren't 4 levels of quality for each criteria? Yes. I think you might be referring to that one where they had to get all of the life cycle stages, and there was nothing in advance. I'm not sure what you'd do. Just make up another stage? That would be silly. It is not. It is rare. It is not something you should go out of your way to do, because and I think part of this was an artifact of it being a retelling task. But if there isn't a reasonable entry for the cell, then no, doesn't have to be there. If you find that happening a lot, what you have is a 3-point scale, and you're trying to make a 4.1. The rule for how to figure out how many levels you need is how many reliable distinctions can you make. So that's the question. And if you can only do a kind of top, middle, bottom, and everything in the middle, like all that you're having trouble with, is it this or a 2 or a 3, then you maybe want to go down to just 3 levels. But a blank box is better than something stupid in the box, yes. Someone has asked, where can we find more on evaluating the quality of thinking? This is, I feel like the shameless commerce department on Car Talk, but I personally have written some books on that that are called things like Assessing Higher Order Thinking, or I have a book on rubrics. But other people besides me have written about assessing quality of thinking as well. Typically, the criteria where you assess thinking is the stuff that you've been trying to teach them about thinking. You're not just all of a sudden at the assessment making up something about thinking. So if you've been trying to have them actually articulate how their supporting details help with their argument for whatever they're claiming in a persuasive writing. So they're trying to persuade you of something, and you give these reasons. And one of the things that you've been trying to say is explain to your reader why that helps make your case. Then that's what you look for. So it's not like we're looking inside the kid's head. We're still looking at evidence in either what they wrote or what they did. I've seen math rubrics for problem solving where the quality of thinking is evaluated by the quality of problem solving strategies that they have selected and explained. Questions like, if they used the strategy they identified, would it in fact lead to a correct solution if they did all the calculating correctly? Those kinds of things. So we're not talking about trying to peek inside the child's head. We're still looking at evidence of thinking in what they've done. Okay. Here's another question. What about cross-curricular performance tasks? Really cool. They require collaboration between the two disciplines, the two teachers, science and art or whatever it is. They can be scored with either separate rubrics for each set of learning goals, one in each discipline, or they can be scored by an agreed-upon cross-disciplinary rubric. Typically, that would have criteria that looked at things from, if it was science, about understanding of science, and art as well. Cross-curricular performance tasks are really another thing they have in common is that it's the kind of task that a lot of people actually have to do once they're done sitting in school classrooms. So maybe the little kids are designing a recycling program, but that doesn't just mean some science stuff. It also means that they have to write good letters to the newspaper or to their principal. And so there might be, what would that be, language arts and science. Real tasks are typically like that. Okay. What type of performance assessments can you create for a PRK3 class? Do you mean pre-kindergarten? If you mean pre-kindergarten, there are all kinds of performance assessments. They tend to be very simple. In fact, we come into life doing performance assessments. I can remember in kindergarten, my own kindergarten, and I won't even tell you how many years ago that was, where a performance assessment we all had to pass was we had to learn to tie our shoes. Not any way we wanted, but the way the teacher wanted us to learn how to tie your shoes. Learning how to hold a pencil, learning how to make a 1 and a 2 and a 3. Those are all performances. Being able to use scissors properly. Little kids don't start out being able to do that. Being able to hold up your left hand or your right hand appropriately. So there are lots of pre-K performance assessments that I can think of that fall in the sort of readiness for print or readiness for numbers. Holding a book properly, being able to turn pages of the book from front to back. All of those are things you watch the student, they're processes you watch the student perform. So there's that one. I hope I have interpreted that question properly. Okay. And I do not see any more questions in either one of my chat boxes. So thank you all for your attention and interest. And I look forward to seeing some of you soon. And I look forward to, I hope, having whetted your appetite for finding out more about performance assessment. Thank you.